A reading from Job. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know, or to stretch the line upon it. Or where its base is sunk, or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together, and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors, when it burst out from the womb, when I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, Thus far shall you come and no farther, and here you shall proud waves be stopped. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, so that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? Is it charged like a clay under the seal, and it is dyed like a garment? Light is withheld from the wicked, and their uplifted arm is broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. The word of the Lord. Before he was Pastor Joe Yucha, he was Joseph Paul Yucha, child of God, and it is my privilege to invite forward Joe to share his faith story this evening.
We'll come back to that reading because that is one of my favorite readings of all time, and we'll maybe tie it in. But when I would lead mission trips at my last congregation, we would come back, and one of the last things we would do before we got back home was talking about the trip with somebody else. And so we created 3 versions of the story. The 30-second, the people who don't really care but feel obligated to ask you how your trip was, so you get one story in. The 5-minute, okay, I think these people know a little bit. Let's share one more in-depth story. And then what we would call the big dump, where you just put everything out there. And we were really selective about who got that. Based on the time frame I got when we were downstairs for this service, I can't do the big dump of my faith story on you guys. I'll try and keep it to the 5-minute version, and we'll see how that goes. So, I'll interweave, I think, a little bit of my life story along with my faith story because I think those go together. And I feel like for those of you who may have been part of my call committee, you got a lot of my life story a couple times. Apologies if it's repeated. But I grew up in Richmond. My mom is from around these parts, Salisbury. My dad's from Pennsylvania, so Richmond was a nice middle ground. And people can never place my accent because when I was in Chicago, I had a southern accent. Down here, I'm a Yankee, and it's a very neutral Richmond accent, which is very close to the Mason-Dixon line. So I am thankful for my muttness in terms of my accent. And we were a family who were dedicated to church. I was in Sunday school in worship every week. There were no ifs, ands, or buts about that, which was a real, at times, contradiction to me from my academic life, where I went to the International Baccalaureate program in middle school, and I did math and science specialty classes in high school, and lots of questions were expected, lots of answers were not to be found at this point, and that really contradicted with me with faith, where it was, this is what you do, this is what you should ask, and this is the answer you will get. Period. So it became a going through the motions for me of you go to church, you go to confirmation, you recite your Bible verses, you recite your creed, Lord's Prayer, whatever. You get the pat on the back, you move on with your faith life. And that's what it became for me. So when I went to college, I moved down here and went to Wake Forest. And church was not the highest priority in my life. I had taken a psychology class in high school and loved it and knew that's what I was going to major in. And at Wake, the courses are grouped into like different kinds of electives, and psychology, philosophy, and religion were one grouping. I was a psychology major with a philosophy minor, so I had no time or need to ever take a religion class. So I didn't think about it. I worked at Lutherock during my time in college, And it was that, plus Virginia was really good at doing statewide youth events. So we would gather for a week over the summer for high schoolers and a weekend in January also for high schoolers, and just get together, sing the camp songs, do large group, small group discussion times, have a really intense prayer, and really feel that sense of community. And I did not feel that when I went to church. I got that when I went back to Lutherock. I got the community. I got the presence of God being filled around me. I got the questions that I so desperately needed, but I wasn't the one asking them. It was from the kids that I was counseling. Well, why would God let this happen? Well, what if God did this? And sometimes I didn't know how to answer because all I had was the rote answers. So again, church didn't feel like it necessarily fit with where I was seeing God. And then about two things happened at about the same time. A friend of mine who had grown up at Augsburg and actually got married by Pastor Paul a couple years back invited me. He was going to a college youth group at First Pres and said, "You're a Christian, but I never see you go to church. You should come with me to youth group." And I realized that some of the people I worked at Lutherock with had grown up here at Augsburg. So I decided to come to Augsburg and try that out. Those two things were really impactful for me, and they would end up coalescing after I graduated from Wake. I was burnt out of school. I wanted to go get a PhD in clinical psychology, but I could not imagine sitting in the classroom another minute at that time. So I took a year off. My boss at Lutherock invited me to come up and live there, basically. He said, "We need people to work retreats. We need people to help winterize the camp. Will you come up and do that?" And while I was there, Augsburg's youth group came up. And so I worked with Chris Almarini and Robin and Jill Fowler and Chris Andrews. I was like, there's four of them. So when I mentioned that I was in Winston and I'd come to Augsburg, and some of them knew who I was because I worked with Anna Fowler, yes. They said, "Well, you should come work with our youth group sometime." And so while I was still in Winston figuring out what I was going to do, I had begun the discernment of, well, maybe it's not psychology that I want to do, but it moves more towards the pastoral ministry. So in some testing out of that, I came and hung out at Augsburg's youth group a few times. I volunteered and then worked for Associates in Christian Counseling. One of my professors was also a therapist there. And in some of those conversations, they asked, "What do you want to do? You say you want to help people. How do you want to do that?" And the best answer I could come up with is therapy seems to ask, what can you do to help yourself? Or what can I do to help you help yourself? And there's a big part of that that's missing for me, and that is, how does God help you? What part of spirituality reinforces you? Where do you turn when you're at your deepest and you cannot help yourself? And that, in talking about that with them, they said, "That sounds like pastoral ministry. It sounds like you could talk to more people about that if you got up and spoke in what's called a sermon every week." So I went home and talked to my home pastor about it, who had been at the church. I believe I was the first baby that he baptized when he got to the church. And actually, his last Sunday when he retired was the Sunday before my first Sunday when I was ordained. So a very cool crossing paths. And so I told him, "This is what I'm doing. I'm considering the future. I'm thinking about going to seminary. What do you think?" And he got up and just walked over and gave me a big hug. And I said, "Okay, that's the affirmation I need." So I start looking at seminary. What does this mean for me? I was going to go back to grad school, and I guess this is it. And Southern is right down the road, and that's where you go. And I had a bit of a panic. I grew up in Virginia. I'm living in North Carolina. If I go to South Carolina, I will never leave this area. And again, very fortunately, an Augsburg member, Dick Schneider, said, "Well, I know somebody at Chicago. I think you'd like it up there." So I applied, and that was that. And getting there was a shock to me because a lot of my classmates, a lot of the people in seminary at the same time with me, had gone to Valparaiso, had gone to a Lutheran school, had taken religion classes, had known they were going to be a pastor since one of them was baptizing his dolls when he was 5 years old. So I had never taken an academic religion class, and my mind was blown. And what it did for me was let me ask those questions that I never felt like I could get asked, that I could ask. And so I felt like this is what I want to do in my pastoral ministry, is how do I offer the space for people to ask questions? Some questions are very clearly answered. Where were you when I created the foundations of the earth? Asked God. I was nowhere. I was dust. I was nothing. I'm minuscule, God. It's humbling to have those. But there are other questions that I think are worthy of exploration and that we just haven't talked about. And so that is my passion with youth ministry in particular, to ask those questions and then to ask all of them. If we're not talking, if we don't have some room for doubt, I don't think we have any room for growth. And so that was affirmed for me at LSTC. It was affirmed for me in my field work. It was affirmed for me on my internship, where I ended up going back and serving for First Call, and everything was really dainty and great and awesome. And then I get back and I start working for real, and they say, okay, here's the rug, we'll lift it up, look at all this. And that challenges your faith, right? Because church is supposed to be that place apart. Church is supposed to be that perfect place where you go to escape the cares of the world, to talk about God, and leave everything else behind. And sometimes that's just not the case. So when you step into it and say, we are human, we are fallible, we were not there when you created the world, God, we cannot give you that answer. It's humbling. And that passage from Job is one of my favorite because it humbles me every time I get, as my grandmother says, too big for my britches. You are a human, you will fail, you cannot mess up my plan, says God. So trust that I'm going to lead you where you are supposed to be, and if you make a detour, I'll bring you back, because you were not there when I laid the foundations of the earth. I'm the one who can bring the light to shine. That's not you. Answer me if you can. So instead of trying to give a false answer to God, I would rather ask a question back and say, God, I'm listening. Please give me your answer, because you have told me very clearly I am not you. And I think that it was that journey from here to Chicago and then back here has really affirmed for me that God is leading, that if I'm willing to listen and not try and put answers out there and not pretend like I know everything, then God is going to be the one who leads me. And that's the faith that I take forward, and it is challenged, it is challenging, but when I get too sure of myself, I open up Job chapter 38.